In the picturesque town of Oak Ridge, nestled among rolling hills and centuries-old oak trees, stood the imposing figure of the county courthouse. Its weathered stone facade had witnessed countless dramas unfold within its halls, but none quite as shocking as the events that would transpire in the summer of 2023. At the center of this story was Arthur Blackwood, a man whose name had long been synonymous with justice and integrity in Oak Ridge. At 62, Arthur had recently retired from his position as a highly respected judge, leaving behind a legacy of fair rulings and unwavering dedication to the law. His salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes gave him an air of distinguished authority, even in retirement. Arthur's wife, Eleanor, had been by his side for 35 years. A soft-spoken woman with a keen intellect, she had always been his anchor, providing support and stability throughout his demanding career. Their marriage, while not perfect, had weathered many storms and was regarded by many in Oak Ridge as a model of enduring love and commitment. The Blackwoods lived in a stately, Victorian home on Maple Avenue, its meticulously maintained garden a testament to Eleanor's green thumb. Their life seemed to be settling into a comfortable rhythm of community events, grandchildren visits, and quiet evenings spent on their wraparound porch. But beneath this serene surface, Arthur Blackwood was grappling with a sense of restlessness. Retirement, while welcome after years of high-pressure decision-making, had left him feeling adrift. He missed the intellectual stimulation of the courtroom, the weight of responsibility that had defined his days for so long. It was in this state of mind that Arthur encountered Zoe Carmichael. 24 years old, with fiery red hair and a quick wit, Zoe was a second-year law student interning at the courthouse. She had a brightness about her, an eagerness to learn that reminded Arthur of his own early days in the legal profession. Their first meeting was innocuous enough. Arthur had stopped by the courthouse to have lunch with his former colleague, Judge Martin Roth. As they walked through the building, reminiscing about old cases, they came across Zoe struggling with a stack of heavy law books. Arthur, ever the gentleman, offered to help. As he took some of the books from her arms, their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Zoe's green eyes widened in recognition. "Judge Blackwood," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "It's an honor to meet you. I've read so many of your rulings." Flattered by her recognition and impressed by her knowledge, Arthur found himself lingering to chat with Zoe long after Judge Roth had excused himself. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on landmark cases and legal philosophies. Arthur was invigorated by Zoe's fresh perspective and passionate arguments. As they parted ways, Arthur felt a spark of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. He told himself it was simply the thrill of intellectual discourse, of mentoring a bright young mind. But deep down, he knew there was something more, something dangerous brewing beneath the surface. Over the next few weeks, Arthur found himself making more frequent trips to the courthouse. He told Eleanor he was catching up with old colleagues, but in truth, he was seeking out opportunities to see Zoe. Their encounters, while brief, became the highlight of his days. Zoe, for her part, was equally drawn to Arthur. She saw in him not just a mentor, but a man of power and wisdom. His attention made her feel special, chosen. She began to stay late at the courthouse, knowing Arthur often stopped by in the evenings. One night, as a summer storm raged outside, Arthur and Zoe found themselves alone in the courthouse library. The air was thick with tension as they discussed a particularly controversial case. Their debate grew heated, their faces flushed with passion for the law and something more. Before either of them fully realized what was happening, Arthur had pulled Zoe into a fierce kiss. In that moment, all thoughts of propriety, of the vast age difference between them, of Arthur's marriage and reputation, vanished. They were consumed by a hunger that had been building for weeks. As the storm outside intensified, so did their passion. Hidden among the towering bookshelves, surrounded by the very laws they had sworn to uphold, Arthur and Zoe gave in to their desires. It was the beginning of an affair that would shake the foundations of Oak Ridge and lead to consequences neither of them could have foreseen. As summer faded into autumn, Arthur and Zoe's affair intensified. They met in secret, stealing moments whenever they could. In the courthouse after hours, in a secluded booth at a diner 2 towns over, even once in Arthur's car parked deep in the woods outside Oak Ridge. Each encounter left them craving more, blind to the growing risks they were taking. Arthur felt rejuvenated, intoxicated by Zoe's youth and passion. He found himself paying more attention to his appearance, buying new clothes, and even hitting the gym. Eleanor noticed the changes in her husband, but attributed them to a post-retirement renaissance. She was happy to see Arthur so energized, never suspecting the true cause. Zoe, meanwhile, was falling deeper under Arthur's spell. She was captivated by his intelligence, his power, and the forbidden nature of their relationship. In her eyes, Arthur was everything the boys her age were not: sophisticated, accomplished, and worldly. She began to imagine a future with him, dismissing the practical obstacles as mere hurdles to be overcome. Their affair might have remained a secret indefinitely, if not for a careless mistake. One evening, as Arthur was rushing to meet Zoe, he accidentally left his phone on the kitchen counter. Eleanor, hearing it buzz repeatedly, glanced at the screen. Her heart sank as she saw a series of messages from Z, filled with heart emojis and suggestive comments. Stunned and heartbroken, Eleanor confronted Arthur when he returned home late that night. She told him, "I know about her, Arthur. How could you do this to us after 35 years?" Arthur, caught off guard, fumbled for explanations, but the truth was written all over his face. The confrontation lasted through the night, with Eleanor alternating between rage and despair. By morning, she delivered an ultimatum: end the affair immediately, or their marriage was over. Arthur, faced with the reality of what he stood to lose, agreed to break things off with Zoe. The next day, Arthur met Zoe at their usual spot in the courthouse library. His voice heavy with regret, he told her, "This has to end, Zoe. I'm sorry, but I can't destroy my marriage, my whole life, for this." Zoe, however, didn't take the news well. Her eyes flashed with anger and hurt as she spat back, "You can't just discard me like this, Arthur. What we have is real." Arthur tried to reason with her, explaining the impossibility of their situation, but Zoe wouldn't listen. As he turned to leave, she grabbed his arm, her voice low and dangerous. "If you leave me," she hissed, "I'll tell everyone about us. Your precious reputation will be in tatters." Shocked by her threat, Arthur pulled away and hurried out of the library, his mind reeling. He had underestimated the depth of Zoe's feelings and the lengths she might go to keep him. Over the next few days, Arthur's phone was bombarded with messages and calls from Zoe, alternating between pleas for reconciliation and threats of exposure. Eleanor, sensing Arthur's distress, demanded to know what was happening. In a moment of weakness, Arthur confessed everything: the affair, Zoe's age, and now her threats. Eleanor was devastated anew, but her practical nature took over. "We need to handle this carefully," she told him, her voice cold with suppressed emotion. Meanwhile, Zoe's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She began showing up at places she knew Arthur frequented: the golf club, his favorite coffee shop, even driving by their house late at night. Her academic performance suffered, and her fellow interns noticed her volatile mood swings. The situation came to a head when Zoe, in a fit of jealous rage, confronted Eleanor at the local grocery store. In full view of shocked onlookers, she screamed at Eleanor, "He doesn't love you anymore. Arthur is mine now." Before Eleanor could respond, Zoe stormed out, leaving a wake of whispers and stares behind her. News of the confrontation spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire. Suddenly, the town was abuzz with rumors about the respected Judge Blackwood and his alleged affair with a woman young enough to be his granddaughter. Arthur and Eleanor retreated into their home, blinds drawn, as reporters and curious neighbors drove by, hoping for a glimpse of the scandal. As autumn leaves began to fall, the Blackwood's carefully constructed life was crumbling around them. Arthur's reputation, built over decades of service, was in tatters. Eleanor struggled with feelings of betrayal and humiliation. And Zoe, consumed by obsession and rejection, was spiraling towards a breaking point that would shock the entire town. Little did anyone know that the worst was yet to come, as Zoe prepared to take drastic action that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. As the scandal continued to unfold, the once quiet town of Oak Ridge found itself divided. Some sympathized with Eleanor, seeing her as the wronged wife standing by her fallen husband. Others, particularly younger residents, saw Arthur as a victim of Zoe's manipulation. Regardless of where people stood, the affair was the talk of the town, discussed in hushed tones at the local diner and debated heatedly on social media. Arthur, desperate to salvage what remained of his reputation and marriage, agreed to Eleanor's suggestion of couples therapy. Dr. Amelia Foster, a respected psychologist from the neighboring town, began seeing them twice a week. During these sessions, Arthur struggled to express his remorse, often falling back on excuses about midlife crisis and momentary weakness. Eleanor, for her part, oscillated between icy silence and bursts of raw anger. In one particularly intense session, Eleanor finally vocalized her deepest fear. She told Arthur, her voice barely above a whisper, "I keep wondering, was I ever enough for you? Or have you been looking for an escape all these years?" The pain in her words cut through Arthur's defenses, forcing him to confront the true impact of his actions. Meanwhile, Zoe's life was unraveling rapidly. Her erratic behavior had not gone unnoticed at the courthouse. Judge Martin Roth, concerned about the rumors and her declining performance, called Zoe into his office. He gently but firmly informed her that her internship was being terminated, effective immediately. Zoe's reaction was explosive. She screamed at Judge Roth, accusing him of conspiring with Arthur to ruin her life. As security escorted her from the building, she shouted threats of lawsuits and exposure, her face contorted with rage and desperation. That evening, Zoe showed up at the Blackwoods' home, pounding on the door and demanding to see Arthur. Eleanor, home alone and terrified, called the police. By the time they arrived, Zoe had vanished, leaving behind a chilling message scratched into the paint of Arthur's car. "You'll pay for this." The incident shook Arthur and Eleanor to their core. They filed for a restraining order against Zoe, hoping it would be enough to keep her at bay. For a few weeks, it seemed to work. Zoe's public outbursts ceased, and she seemed to vanish from Oak Ridge entirely. But Zoe hadn't given up. She was merely regrouping, her obsession with Arthur and desire for revenge growing stronger by the day. She rented a small apartment in a neighboring town, using it as a base to plot her next move. Her walls became covered with newspaper clippings about Arthur, printouts of his old cases, and candid photos she had taken during their affair. As Halloween approached, bringing with it a sense of unease and impending doom, Zoe put her plan into action. She knew that Arthur, despite the scandal, had agreed to give a guest lecture at the local law school. It was to be his first public appearance since the affair had come to light, a carefully orchestrated attempt to begin rebuilding his image. On the day of the lecture, the auditorium was packed. Students, faculty, and curious townspeople filled every seat, eager to see how the disgraced judge would comport himself. Eleanor, showing a united front, sat in the front row, her face a mask of composure. Arthur took the podium, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his notes. He began his lecture on ethics in the justice system, the irony of which was not lost on the audience. As he spoke, he seemed to gain confidence, his voice growing stronger as he delved into the complexities of the law. Halfway through the lecture, a commotion at the back of the auditorium drew everyone's attention. Zoe burst through the doors, her eyes wild and unfocused. In her hand, she clutched a small revolver. The audience gasped and ducked for cover as Zoe strode down the aisle, the gun trained on Arthur. "You ruined my life!" Zoe shouted, her voice echoing in the now silent auditorium. "You made me believe in us, and then you threw me away like I was nothing." Arthur, his face pale with shock and fear, raised his hands placatingly. "Zoe, please," he begged. "Put the gun down. We can talk about this." But Zoe was beyond reason. She continued her advance, ranting about their affair, the promises she claimed Arthur had made, and how he had betrayed her. The security guards, caught off guard by her sudden appearance, were slowly making their way towards her, but it was clear they wouldn't reach her in time. As Zoe reached the front of the auditorium, mere feet away from Arthur, Eleanor suddenly stood up. Without a word, she placed herself between her husband and the gun. The entire room held its breath, the tension palpable as Eleanor stared down the barrel of the revolver. "Zoe," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm, "this isn't the answer. Whatever Arthur did, however he hurt you, this won't make it right. Please, give me the gun." For a moment, it seemed as if Eleanor's words had broken through Zoe's rage. The young woman's hand trembled, the gun lowering slightly. But then, with a cry of anguish, Zoe raised the weapon again, her finger tightening on the trigger. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the auditorium, followed by screams of terror from the audience. In the chaos that ensued, no one was immediately sure what had happened or who, if anyone, had been hit. As the dust settled, the true outcome of Zoe's desperate act would become clear, forever changing the lives of everyone involved in this tragic tale of love, betrayal, and obsession. The gunshot's echo had barely faded when security guards tackled Zoe, disarming her and pinning her to the ground. As the chaos subsided, gasps of horror rippled through the crowd. Eleanor Blackwood lay motionless on the floor, a growing red stain spreading across her chest. Arthur, his face ashen with shock, fell to his knees beside his wife. "Eleanor!" he cried, cradling her head in his lap. "Someone call an ambulance!" His voice, usually so composed, cracked with desperation and fear. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but for Eleanor, it was too late. She was pronounced dead at the scene, her final act one of protection, and perhaps, in some way, forgiveness for the man she had loved for over 3 decades. As Zoe was led away in handcuffs, her face a mask of shock and disbelief, Arthur remained on the floor, holding Eleanor's lifeless body. The man who had once commanded respect and admiration was now a broken figure, his sobs echoing in the stunned silence of the auditorium. The following days were a blur of police interviews, funeral arrangements, and media frenzy. Oak Ridge found itself thrust into the national spotlight, the tragic end to the scandalous affair making headlines across the country. Zoe Carmichael was charged with first-degree murder. As details of her obsession came to light during the investigation, including the shrine-like apartment filled with Arthur's photos and case files, public opinion began to shift. Many who had initially blamed Arthur now saw him as a victim of a disturbed young woman's fixation. The trial, held 6 months later, was a somber affair. Arthur, looking years older than his age, testified about the affair and its aftermath. His voice heavy with regret, he told the court, "I made a terrible mistake, one that cost me everything I held dear. My weakness, my selfishness, led to this tragedy. I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life." Zoe's defense team attempted to paint her as a victim of manipulation by an older, powerful man, but the evidence of her escalating behavior and the premeditated nature of her actions at the law school were damning. After a 2-week trial, the jury found Zoe guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Arthur, the aftermath of the tragedy left him a changed man. He sold the house on Maple Avenue, unable to bear the memories it held. He retreated from public life, declining interviews and avoiding social gatherings. Those who saw him around town described a shell of the man he once was, his shoulders stooped under the weight of guilt and grief. In a final twist of irony, Arthur found himself drawn back to the law, not as a judge, but as an advocate for ethics reform in the legal profession. He began giving lectures at law schools across the state, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of ethical breaches and the abuse of power. During one such lecture, 2 years after Eleanor's death, Arthur addressed a packed auditorium of law students. His voice, once commanding, now carried a hint of weariness as he spoke. "The law is not just a set of rules," he told them. "It's a sacred trust. When we break that trust, when we allow our personal desires to override our duty, we risk destroying not just our own lives, but the lives of those around us." As he concluded his talk, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "After everything that happened," she asked, "do you think redemption is possible?" Arthur paused, considering the question. The room was silent, every student leaning forward, eager for his response. Finally, he spoke, his words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Redemption," he said slowly, "is a journey, not a destination. It requires acknowledging our mistakes, facing the consequences, and dedicating ourselves to being better than we were. It's a lifelong process, and one that I'm still navigating every day. But if my story can prevent even one person from making the same mistakes I did, then perhaps that's a start." As Arthur left the podium that day, the applause that followed him was subdued, respectful. It wasn't the adulation he had once known as a respected judge, but rather an acknowledgement of a man who had fallen from grace and was now struggling to find a path toward redemption. The tragedy that unfolded in Oak Ridge served as a stark reminder of how quickly a moment of weakness can spiral into devastating consequences. It left an indelible mark on the town and all those involved, a somber testament to the destructive power of unchecked desire and the long shadow cast by our choices.